By the mid-1990s, the role-playing genre of video games had taken over Japan. New releases in the Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy series became major events. More experimental titles from game developers Squaresoft and Enix became overnight successes, launching their own celebrated series. It was during this first major wave of hits, primarily on Nintendo's Super Famicom and Super Nintendo consoles, that brought together some of gaming's most notable creators. And it wouldn't just be game makers either, with a well-known manga artist joining their ranks to lay the foundation and design of one of the most beloved role-playing games of all time. Everything has a story. This is the story of the Chrono series. In this series, we'll be taking a look at the development, release, and legacy of each game from the Chrono series. In this part, we'll exclusively focus on the first entry of the franchise, Chrono Trigger for the Super Nintendo. In 1992, while touring America to see the latest in video game graphical technology, Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yuji Horii, and Akira Toriyama laid the foundation for a new game title. Sakaguchi, known for creating and producing the Final Fantasy series, wanted to create a game unlike anything before. Collaborating with Yuji Horii, the creator of Dragon Quest, and Akira Toriyama, the creator of Dragon Ball and character designer for Dragon Quest, the three men became known as the Dream Team. Early production for this dream project came together slowly. The amount of ideas for the title caused the game to languish in the minds of its creators for over a year, before Kazuhiko Aoki stepped in to produce the title. At the time, Aoki was best known for producing Final Fantasy III and IV, but still knew he had his work cut out for him. With Aoki on board, a team of over 50 developers were brought together to begin work on the game in early 1993. At first, the title was being developed as a new entry in the Mana series of action RPGs, under the working title Maru Island. Early designs were drawn up for the title to be put onto the upcoming CD-based add-on to the Super Famicom. The idea was shelved after disputes between Sony and Nintendo caused the Nintendo PlayStation to never materialize. Development was shifted to the Super Famicom's cartridges instead, and given a new title, Chrono Trigger, as designs for the series began to stray further from the Mana series' core design. For the story, Yuji Horii put together a rough outline, inspired by a suggestion from another developer to focus the game's scenario on time travel. Akira Toriyama helped expand beyond these ideas, while also designing the main characters for the game and the signature art style that the Chrono series would become known for. Sakaguchi also helped with the story, adding new characters and suggesting script changes. However, the bulk of the actual story for Chrono Trigger was handled by Masato Kato. Kato began his career in video games at Tecmo. His first projects with the company were as an artist for Captain Tsubasa and Ninja Gaiden. After the success of Ninja Gaiden, Kato was promoted to director of action sequences for the game's two sequels. This became Kato's first experience with writing for video games. During 1993, he left Tecmo and joined Squaresoft. He joined Chrono Trigger's team of developers and was given the massive undertaking of creating a script from the story Horii outlined. Kato wrote a majority of the script for the title, but found it difficult to branch out the story beyond its linear confines. He proposed the idea of multiple endings for the game, many of which were written by other writers at Square. Music for the title was handled by Yasunori Mitsuda. Mitsuda joined Square in mid-1992 as a composer, although he would not compose a soundtrack until Chrono Trigger. Instead, he spent his early days working on sound design for various Square titles, including Final Fantasy V. Unhappy with his work in sound design, Mitsuda approached Sakaguchi to compose for a new game. Mitsuda was then given the reins for the soundtrack of Chrono Trigger. He worked tirelessly on the game, often passing out from exhaustion. Before he could finish, Mitsuda contracted stomach ulcers from overworking, leaving the soundtrack incomplete. Final Fantasy composer Nobuo Uematsu stepped in to finish the soundtrack, contributing a total of 10 tracks. In total, over 60 different tracks were composed for the title, an unprecedented amount for the time. Development for Chrono Trigger went by at a lightning speed. Despite setbacks from the cancelled CD add-on for the Super Famicom, Chrono Trigger's team worked day and night to get the game ready for a late 1994 release. Like many projects from Square, the title was delayed, not being able to come out until early 1995. The entire game was put onto a 32 megabit cartridge, with battery-backed RAM that allowed the game to save progress. Much of the memory was devoted to new and challenging technical ideas, one of which broke the mold for many RPGs of the time. The enemies of Chrono Trigger did not appear as static images in front of the player at random, like they did in the Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest series. Enemies appeared on the overworld, with the player as they moved about. They had their own animation cycles, and battles took place in the same areas where the creatures were encountered, without having to transition to different screens. After 2 years of development, Chrono Trigger released on the Super Famicom in Japan on March 11, 1995. Chrono Trigger was an immediate hit in the region. Within 2 months of release, Chrono Trigger sold over 2 million copies. This was accompanied by praise from game critics, with the title receiving a 34 out of 40 from Famitsu. In Japan, Chrono Trigger became the third best-selling game of the year, being beaten by Enix's Dragon Quest V and Rare's Donkey Kong Country 2. For North America, a quick localization was desired. 1995 saw 2 major home consoles hit the scene, with many fearing that the title released for the Super Nintendo would be lost in the mix of the new 32-bit home consoles. Square turned to Ted Woolsey, a former Japanese literature PhD student, to handle the localization. Woolsey was no stranger to Square's titles. His first work with the company was localizing Final Fantasy Legend III for the Game Boy. He later worked on major titles like Secret of Mana, Final Fantasy VI, and Breath of Fire. Woolsey was given 30 days to translate the script and have it ready to be approved by Nintendo of America. Like so many others, Woolsey worked around the clock to complete the script, as he liked any translation tools or a team to help him along the way. Despite the hardships, Woolsey would later recall that Chrono Trigger was one of the most satisfying games he ever worked on. Chrono Trigger launched in North America on August 11, 1995, only 5 months after the Japanese release. The game was an immediate hit with critics. Critics praised the game's story, beautiful art style, easy to understand combat, and the game's score. Chrono Trigger won many awards at Electronic Gaming Monthly's End of the Year Awards, including Best Role-Playing Game and Best Super Nintendo Game for 1995. Chrono Trigger also won Best RPG from GamePro. Sales in North America wouldn't reach the same heights as it did in Japan, selling a modest 300,000 units. Unfortunately, Japan and North America were the only regions to receive the game until the late 2000s. Chrono Trigger follows the story of Chrono, a young silent boy who is sent back in time to rescue a girl he just met named Marley, after Marley was sent back in time in an accident caused by Chrono's friend Luca's teleportation machine. From there, the cast discovers new characters, including a talking frog, a futuristic robot, and a primitive woman from the Stone Age. Eventually, the team of unlikely allies set out to defeat Lavos, an embodiment of evil that will destroy the world in the year 1999. Chrono Trigger jumps between multiple time periods during its story, ranging from the ancient past to the distant future, all the way until the end of time. Each time period has its own distinct style and characters, leading each new period to feel completely different from the last. This is further helped by Toriyama's unique art style that adds a level of character that other Square RPGs couldn't match. The beautiful soundtrack ranges from upbeat carnival tunes to cathedral-ready pieces that sound like they're worshipping the gods. The punchy sound design helps bring the story and combat to life. All of this combines around a simple but fast-paced gameplay inspired by the Final Fantasy series' active time battle system. The unique spin being character-specific combo attacks that change the way each composition of your party plays. Chrono Trigger included many new ideas for video games at the time. The game's multiple endings offered an interactive option to story conclusions, giving video games an avenue to differentiate themselves from linear storytelling. Another innovation, New Game Plus, allowed players to replay the game to get all the endings they could, without having to drag themselves through the slog of releveling characters or finding the game's best items all over again. All of these fantastic features led to Chrono Trigger being considered one of the best games released for the Super Nintendo. But it wouldn't remain exclusive to the system for long. In 1999, a port of the game was released on the PlayStation, developed by Toei. The port didn't receive any new gameplay additions and was hampered by long load times when compared to the original cartridge-based release. Fans were treated to some new content. Brand new cutscenes, animated by Toei, were created for the game under the supervision of Toriyama. A total of 10 scenes were made from the game, including a new opening. In North America, the port of Chrono Trigger was released alongside Final Fantasy IV as Final Fantasy Chronicles in 2001. A second port of Chrono Trigger was announced in June of 2008. This port would bring the game to Nintendo's DS system. Tosei once again worked on the development of the port, while Matsuda Kato returned to supervise the project. The Nintendo DS port received a revised translation, alongside new gameplay elements. 2 new dungeons and a monster arena were included with the port, alongside quality of life improvements to make the game easy to play on the DS's 2 screens. The port also featured the animated cutscenes from the PlayStation version of the game. North America and Japan received the game in 2008, with the European release of the classic RPG coming out in 2009. This is the version of Chrono Trigger I ended up playing. After hearing the countless stories of how good the game was, I received my own copy for the Nintendo DS around Christmas time in 2008. I quickly played through the entire game, soaking up the wonderful world of Chrono Trigger along the way. As soon as the credits rolled, I started a new playthrough, and beat it again. It quickly became one of my favorite games. Before I even started working on this video, I replayed Chrono Trigger for the first time in almost a decade, just to see how it held up. I was still moved by the game's story, I still had a blast with the game's fast-paced combat. I'm still listening to the soundtrack. Chrono Trigger has aged like a fine wine, and every time I return to it, I find something new to love about it. Even after my first playthrough almost 12 years ago, and the game's release almost 25 years ago, I love this game. So much so that I consider it my favorite game of all time. But there's more to the story beyond this singular title. And what lies beyond is the foundation for what could have been a series as popular as Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest. In mid-1995, Nintendo released a new add-on for their successful Famicom console. Created by Nintendo R&D 2, the same team behind the Super Famicom, this new accessory was known as the Satellaview. The Satellaview offered a brand new way to play games through the internet. Utilizing satellite broadcasting, players were able to download games to a special cartridge released with the Satellaview. Many third-party developers jumped on board to create titles for the new service, including Squaresoft. Starting in late July of 1995, 3 Chrono Trigger related titles began broadcast for the Satellaview. The first was Chrono Trigger Jet Bike Special. This was an expanded version of the racing minigame from the 2300 AD section of Chrono Trigger. The other 2 titles, Chrono Trigger Character Library and Music Library, included deep dives into the various characters and enemies of Chrono Trigger and a collection of music from the game respectively. The character and music libraries would later be included with the port of Chrono Trigger for the PlayStation. Jet Bike Special was never released beyond the Satellaview broadcast system. Thanks to game preservationists, the title is still playable via emulators. Square's ambitions for the Satellaview service went beyond simple mini-games and library collections. In 1995, with Chrono Trigger complete, Square approached Masato Kato, the writer behind much of Chrono Trigger's story, to develop a sequel for the Satellaview service. Kato, fearing he wouldn't be able to match the success of the first game, opted to go down a different path for the next release. Instead of a full-blown RPG that spanned hours, the next iteration of the series would be a text-based adventure. Kato began work on crafting a story for this new project under the title Radical Dreamers. Once again, he was accompanied by Yasunori Matsuda, who provided the soundtrack for the game. Kato wrote the bulk of the story for the game, leaving many of the alternate endings to other writers at Square. Alongside these writers were artists designing various characters, monsters, and scenes for the game. The entire production cycle lasted only 3 months. Radical Dreamers was available in the Satellaview broadcast service beginning on February 3rd, 1996, with the initial broadcast running until February 9th. An additional broadcast was held later that month, from February 24th to March 1st. The entire game was available for play at the time of download, unlike other titles that released their content in piecemeal episodic content on the Satellaview. Radical Dreamers also featured unlimited plays, whereas other titles on the service would often limit the number of plays for the player. The story of Radical Dreamers follows the main character Surge and 2 non-player characters, Kid and Magil. They travel through the castle of the game's antagonist Lynx in search of the Frozen Flame. Battles take place as the cast make their way into the castle against enemies familiar from Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy. Radical Dreamers kept some of Chrono Trigger's role-playing game aspects. Occasional battles would occur with the player controlling Surge. While not as dynamic as Chrono Trigger's battle, every attack is described in great detail, as well-designed pixelated monsters stare through the screen. The bulk of the gameplay revolves around puzzle solving, with the player sending Surge and friends back and forth through the castle as they attempt to claim Lynx's treasure. Along the way, new characters are met, including Lady Riddle, the adopted daughter of Lynx. The entire adventure culminates with the three heroes finding out Lynx's true intentions, to take a special gift Kid received from her sister, the Chrono Trigger, during a dynamic battle over the Frozen Flame. Radical Dreamers is notably darker in tone when compared to the more lighthearted Chrono Trigger. The dark hallways and eerie music make the game almost feel like a horror title. However, small comedic moments help brighten the mood and keep the game from being too bleak. Kato later stated that the darker tone of the title came from working on Chrono Trigger. The long hours and hectic schedule to meet the game's release had weighed heavily on the young director. Radical Dreamers wasn't as easy to work on as either. The 3-month production was rushed, and not given the same level of attention as Square's cartridge-based titles. Despite being a sequel, many of the references to Chrono Trigger were added towards the end of production, and none of the main cast make an appearance in the game. Kato felt the story of Radical Dreamers was left in an unfinished state, and it has been part of the reason why the game has never been re-released on any other platforms. In June of 2000, the Satellaview broadcast came to an end after a 5-year run. With all broadcasts ending, titles released on the service were only playable if they had been downloaded to the special ROM cartridges needed to play them. Radical Dreamers, alongside hundreds of other titles, quickly became rare commodities, especially to those outside of Japan who never had access to the Satellaview service. To make matters worse, Radical Dreamers was never officially released in any language other than Japanese, meaning countless fans were unable to play the sequel to one of gaming's most cherished RPGs. Attempts were made to bring Radical Dreamers to other platforms over the years. A port for the PlayStation was planned for release alongside Chrono Trigger as an unlockable Easter egg. However, Kato disapproved of this port due to being unhappy with the final project. A similar situation occurred when Chrono Trigger was ported to the Nintendo DS, although Kato seems more open to an official release of the long-lost title. Not all hope is lost, however. In 2003, a group known as Demi-Force released a fan translation for Radical Dreamers. Playable through a Super Nintendo emulator, the translation was the first opportunity for non-Japanese players to play the title. Review outlets praised the translation, and other groups took notice. Radical Dreamers was subsequently translated into other languages. While many fans of the Chrono series want to return to Radical Dreamers, Kato seems unlikely to re-release the title as is. For Kato, Radical Dreamers is not part of the official Chrono timeline. Instead, it offers an alternative reality to the events of Chrono Trigger and its subsequent sequel. But my advice to you is to play the game. While short, Radical Dreamers offers a new and interesting take on the world of Chrono Trigger. The title is relatively short, coming in at only around 3 hours of length, and has multiple endings that can be unlocked after the first playthrough. While Radical Dreamers may not be the shiny sequel Chrono fans hope to see, a new title in the series was never far off. With the basis of the next game laid out by Radical Dreamers, Kato would continue to work on new titles for Square, including the final game in the Chrono series, Chrono Cross. Early concepts for a sequel to Chrono Trigger on the PlayStation began in 1996, when Tetsuya Takashi, the graphics director for Chrono Trigger, and his wife, Kaori Tanaka, the graphic designer at Square, submitted a proposed story for Final Fantasy VII. Executives at Square found the story to be too dark for the Final Fantasy franchise. Concepts for this project were then shifted to a sequel for Chrono Trigger. However, this title was eventually released as its own separate game known as Xenogears. Xenogears was developed over a 2-year time span and brought on many veterans from the Chrono Trigger development team. Masato Kato served as a scriptwriter for the title, and Yasunori Mitsuda provided the soundtrack for the game. Xenogears released in 1998 in both Japan and North America. With development complete, Masato Kato was approached by Square once again to dive into the world of Chrono to create a fully realized sequel for the PlayStation, Chrono Cross. was born. For this new project, Kato served as both the writer and director of the title, similar to his role with Radical Dreamers. Thanks in part to Radical Dreamers' rushed development, Kato felt the game was left in an unfinished state and wished to return to the premise of the game. Notably, Kato wanted to return to the characters of Kid and Surge, who would become the main protagonists for the title. Both characters received much more fleshed out designs when compared to their Satellaview counterparts. Full development of the title began in 1998 with a massive team behind it. Around 80 different people worked on the project at its peak, with an additional 20 cutscene artists developing full motion videos for the game, and roughly 100 quality assurance testers. Yasunori Mitsuda returned once again to compose the soundtrack. Mitsuda returned to many of the songs from Radical Dreamers when working on Chrono Cross, while developing plenty of new songs to go with the game. For Chrono Cross, there was a lot of pressure on the development team to live up to the lofty standards the dream team of Chrono Trigger had set. Rather than develop the title as a full sequel to the Super Nintendo original, Kato and his team set out to develop a new game set within the world of Chrono. Development strayed from Chrono Trigger as time went on, as concepts like time travel were dropped. Instead, Chrono Cross centered its story around parallel worlds, and the similar events that take place in between the two. Throughout the player's journey, they would travel between their homeworld and an alternative world where the protagonist Surge had died several years earlier. A new combat system was developed for the game as well. Chrono Trigger's variation of the active time battle system that was popular in many Square's RPGs of the time was replaced with a new combat system that utilized a stamina bar and limited use elements during battle. This new combat system also discarded a traditional level up system, instead offering stat buffs after defeating certain boss characters during the story. Kato's stated reasoning for this new combat system was to avoid repetitive battling and grinding, which were seen in many role-playing games during the PlayStation era. He also likened the system to that of a card game. Each new element a player equipped to a character was like a card in a deck, and it was the player's best goal to create the best characters they could with their finite resources. After a year and a half of development, Chrono Cross released on the PlayStation on November 18, 1999 in Japan. A demo of the game was made available in the region with the purchase of the title Legend of Mana, which released a few months earlier in July of 1999. The release came a few weeks after the PlayStation port of Chrono Trigger as well. The title was a major hit in Japan, although it sold significantly less than Chrono Trigger did in the region. A total of roughly 850,000 copies of the game were sold in the region, less than half of Chrono Trigger's 2 million in 1995. Critical reception was once again strong, with reviewing outlet Famitsu awarding the game a 36 out of 40. For the North American release, Squaresoft chose Richard Honeywood to localize the game over a period of 3 months. Honeywood previously led the localization of Xenogears, making him a good fit for the PlayStation title. Chrono Cross released in North America on August 15, 2000. The game was published by Square Electronic Arts, a joint venture between Square and EA to publish Square's titles in North America. The North American release was well received, despite the game coming out towards the end of the PlayStation's lifecycle in the region. IGN awarded the game a 9.7 out of 10, praising the game's story and characters. GameStop awarded the game a rare 10 out of 10, and gave it their Console Game of the Year award for the year 2000. Fans were impressed by the game as well, with North American gamers purchasing 650,000 copies of the game. While many praised the gorgeous graphics, fun gameplay, and interesting story, many felt let down by the title's lack of similarities to Chrono Trigger, despite being billed as a sequel to the game. Europe would once again miss out on the Chrono series. Although the title was trademarked with the European Union, Chrono Cross was never released in the region. Like Radical Dreamers before it, Chrono Cross follows the story of Surge, a teenager from a small village who gets warped to another world. This alternative world is similar to his own, but after talking with people from his village, Surge realizes a horrible truth. In this alternate world, Surge died 10 years ago, splitting reality into a world where he lived and a world where he died. Surge is then joined by Kid, a young female thief, and many other characters as he attempts to return to his own world while also getting caught up in the schemes of Lynx, a cat-like demi-human who wishes to control the frozen flame. The world of Chrono Cross takes place in the El Nido archipelago. The series of islands host various cities, villages, monsters, and 6 mythical dragons, with each dragon representing an attack element within the game. El Nido is much smaller than the RPG worlds of its era, consisting of a few dozen locations to explore during the journey. Unlike in Chrono Trigger, where the player had an option of up to 7 characters to choose from when creating their party by the end of the game, Chrono Cross boasts 45 different playable characters, although not all characters are recruitable during a single playthrough. Chrono Cross offered many of the same replay options as Chrono Trigger and Radical Dreamers, with multiple endings available depending on how the player completed the game. Most of the endings are exclusive to the game's New Game Plus mode. Despite being marketed as a sequel, Chrono Cross shared little in common with its predecessor. With new themes, characters, and combat, you could easily mistake Chrono Cross as a completely separate series. Like Radical Dreamers, many of the references to Chrono Trigger are hidden deep into the game's story. Characters from the past game did make appearances, and the story of Chrono Trigger was fleshed out further, but by no means is Chrono Cross Chrono Trigger 2, which was part of Masato Kato's stated goal for the title. Following the release of Chrono Cross, no new titles have been created within the Chrono series. A third title in the series was rumored starting in 2001 when Square trademarked the name Chrono Break. The title, presumably for the PlayStation 2, was never announced, and the trademark lapsed in 2003. Masato Kato left Square Enix shortly after the release of Chrono Cross, which should help explain why the series was never explored further. He worked on the MMORPG Final Fantasy XI for the company before leaving to become a freelance worker in the game development industry. Yasunori Mitsuda also left Square, although he did so in 1998 before the release of Chrono Cross. Akira Toriyama and Yuji Horii have both continued to work on the Dragon Quest franchise, while Hironobu Sakaguchi left Square in the early 2000s to create his own game development studio. Chrono Cross has only seen one release outside of its original PlayStation release. In 2011, Chrono Cross released on the PlayStation Network's line of PlayStation 1 classics. Chrono Trigger was released under the same banner that year, as well as on the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console. Chrono Trigger continues to carry the banner for the series today. In 2011, mobile ports of the title were released for iOS and Android devices. In 2018, a PC port of the game based on the mobile versions was released through Steam. While initially panned by gamers for being a rushed and lazy port, later updates have made the game more in line with the versions seen on home consoles and handhelds. With Chrono Trigger being one of my favorite games of all time, it's a shame that the series was never given a proper chance to join the likes of Square's other classic franchises. It seems like Square's only concern with these titles is keeping the prestige and legacy of Chrono Trigger alive through occasional re-releases. But even that seems somewhat untrue. As of the release of this video, Chrono Trigger is not available on any current consoles, and Square has not indicated that it will be released on them or any future platforms. Chrono Cross has it worse, with most gamers' best option for playing the game being the PlayStation 3, a system that was discontinued over 5 years ago. Even 20 years after Chrono Cross's release, the title is not available for purchase in any European markets, leaving players with no choice other than piracy. Despite these obstacles, I would take it upon yourself to experience these classic games, including Radical Dreamers. The world of Chrono is a fascinating one, with plenty of twists and turns to keep you engaged. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of Chrono Cross, I still had a good time playing it and challenging all the game's various bosses. Radical Dreamers is a fantastic piece of media that was almost lost to time, and Chrono Trigger, well, I still love it to this day. Thanks for watching. This was the final part in a series about the story of the Chrono series. If you missed any previous episodes, be sure to check them out. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and share it on your favorite social media sites. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to catch the next video whenever it releases, and let me know what you would like to see covered in future videos down in the comments below. And once again, thank you for watching.